The night air over Zadar carried the salt of the Adriatic and the whispers of betrayal. In the early 1400s, this fortified Dalmatian city stood at a crossroads of empires. To the west, the merchant princes of Venice coveted every stone of its harbors, dreaming of a maritime empire that stretched unbroken across the Adriatic. To the east, the Kingdom of Hungary-Croatia struggled to keep its grip on the Dalmatian coast, torn apart by internal feuds and foreign ambitions. And in Naples, a king desperate for power and coin was about to make a decision that would shatter centuries of Croatian autonomy. The man at the heart of this storm was King Ladislaus of Naples. Born into the royal Anjou dynasty, he had spent his life fighting rivals for thrones that crumbled beneath his feet. By 1409, he held only a fragile claim to the Hungarian-Croatian crown. His armies were exhausted, his treasury empty, and his enemies relentless. To Ladislaus, the Dalmatian coast was no homeland. It was a bargaining chip, a set of glittering ports whose value could be measured in gold florins. His courtiers whispered of Venetian envoys offering impossible sums for the rights to Dalmatia. First, he scoffed. But as the months dragged on and his coffers ran dry, desperation began to drown pride. Venice had waited for this moment with the patience of a predator. For decades, the most serene republic had hungered for control of the eastern Adriatic. Its fleets ruled the sea, but Dalmatian cities like Zadar, Split, and Sebenik remained stubbornly tied to the Hungarian crown. Venetian merchants understood that whoever commanded these ports controlled the lifeline of Mediterranean trade. Yet the Venetians knew brute force alone would not secure their prize. Wars were expensive. Diplomacy, when sharpened like a dagger, was cheaper and cleaner. Behind the marble walls of the Doge's palace, the Senate plotted with meticulous care. Envoys were dispatched under cover of legitimate trade missions. Spies tracked the movements of Ladislaus' agents. Gold was quietly set aside, not for armies, but for signatures. They called it a pactum, but the men in the shadowed council chambers knew it was something darker, a theft disguised as a treaty. Zadar itself simmered with tension. The city's narrow streets echoed with the clang of blacksmiths' hammers and the guttural songs of sailors from every corner of the Adriatic. Merchants from Venice, Dubrovnik, and Ragusa jostled for contracts while local nobles debated fiercely behind closed doors. Some argued that aligning with Venice could bring wealth and stability. Others spat the word Venetian like a curse, warning that the Republic's friendship was a velvet trap. The citizens of Zadar remembered well the brutal Venetian sieges of the past, when the Lion of St. Mark had clawed at their gates and left smoking ruins in its wake. As summer gave way to autumn, secret negotiations unfolded like a dangerous game of chess. Venetian emissaries, clad in fine silks and carrying coded letters, slipped into Zadar under the guise of trade envoys. They met with Ladislaus representatives in candlelit chambers, where the smell of wax mingled with the tension of betrayal. Every word was measured. Every gesture was a test. Would the king sell what generations of Croats had fought to defend? Ladislaus wavered. His pride recoiled at the thought of surrendering Dalmatia, but reality gnawed at him like a rat in the dark. His army was scattered, his allies unreliable, and the Hungarian nobles who once supported his claim were plotting his downfall. Venice offered 100,000 ducats, a fortune so immense it could pay his soldiers, bribe his enemies, and buy him time to fight another day. The king's advisors urged acceptance. Majesty, one counselor is said to have whispered, "Better to sell a province than to lose a crown." While kings and senators bargained, the people of Dalmatia lived in uneasy suspense. In the hill villages outside Zadar, farmers sharpened their scythes, fearing war might sweep through their fields. Fishermen on the coast whispered of strange galleys sighted at dusk, their sails bearing no insignia. Priests preached caution from their pulpits, urging the faithful to pray for deliverance from both foreign greed and domestic treachery. The very air seemed to vibrate with the knowledge that something irreversible was coming. In Venice, the Doge himself, Michel Steno, prepared for the final stroke. Reports from his spies painted a portrait of a king ready to sell. The Senate convened in secret, authorizing a sum of 100,000 gold ducats, an astronomical figure even for the wealthy republic. Chests of coin were prepared, each piece polished to a gleam. Contracts were drafted in Latin, sealed with crimson wax and the emblem of the winged lion. The plan was simple. Ladislaus would relinquish all claims to Dalmatia, and Venice would gain not only the ports but the right to station garrisons, collect taxes, and rule the coast as its own. The fateful meeting was arranged in Zadar, but not within the city walls. Fearful of riots, the negotiators chose a secluded monastery just outside the gates. On a moonless night, Venetian envoys arrived by boat, their cloaks heavy with the weight of coin and secrecy. Torches flickered against the stone walls as the men gathered in a chamber thick with incense and anxiety. Witnesses would later recall the sound of parchment unrolling and the scratch of quills as the pact was signed. With each stroke of ink, centuries of Croatian autonomy slipped away. By dawn, the deed was done. Ladislaus, weary and grim, accepted the gold and sealed the treaty with his royal signet. Venice gained not just territory but legitimacy, a legal claim that no army could challenge without risking the wrath of Christendom. To the outside world, it was a diplomatic triumph. To the people of Dalmatia, it was a betrayal beyond words. The news spread like wildfire. In Zadar, church bells tolled not in celebration but in mourning. Nobles who had argued for resistance cursed the king's name, while merchants calculated how to profit under their new Venetian masters. Across the Adriatic, the Senate erupted in jubilation. The Lion of St. Mark had devoured its prize without drawing a sword. Yet even as the Venetian banners were prepared for unfurling, resistance simmered in the mountains. Highland clans of the hinterland, fiercely independent and contemptuous of foreign rule, vowed never to bow to Venice. In hidden valleys, warriors sharpened their spears and swore oaths beneath the stars. The sale of Dalmatia might have been sealed on parchment, but in the hearts of the Croatian people, the fight for freedom was only beginning. The Pact of Zadar was more than a treaty. It was a turning point that reshaped the balance of power in the Adriatic. It revealed the ruthless pragmatism of Venice, the desperation of a king, and the enduring spirit of a people who refused to be bought. The gold that passed hands that night would fund wars and bribe allies, but it could never purchase the loyalty of those who called the Dalmatian coast their home. This was no ordinary political maneuver. It was the silent theft of a kingdom, a heist carried out not with swords, but with ink, coin, and cunning. And though the Venetians celebrated their bloodless victory, they would soon discover that ruling Dalmatia would demand more than gold. It would require crushing a people whose memory of betrayal burned brighter than any torch along the Adriatic shore. The night Venice stole a kingdom was only the beginning. The mountains of Croatia would echo with defiance for centuries, and the pact signed in secrecy would ignite conflicts that neither king nor republic could fully control. The Adriatic had a new master, but the price of conquest was only beginning to be paid. The ink on the Pact of Zadar had barely dried when the Adriatic began to tremble with the consequences. At sunrise, Venetian galleys slid silently into Zadar's harbor, their black hulls cutting through the morning mist like blades. The people of the city, who had gone to bed under the rule of a distant king, awoke to the sight of crimson and gold banners unfurling across their skyline. The winged lion of St. Mark, once a distant threat, now prowled their very streets. Bells clanged from the towers, but they rang not for celebration. They sounded like alarms, warnings of a new order descending from the sea. Venetian captains wasted no time asserting control. Soldiers in polished breastplates marched through the stone gates, their halberds gleaming in the early light. They spoke little, letting the rhythm of their boots announce the shift of power. Town criers followed, unrolling proclamations that declared the city and its surrounding territories now part of the most serene republic. Taxes would henceforth be paid to Venice. Trade would be regulated by Venetian law. Anyone resisting would face swift and merciless punishment. The reaction among the citizens was a storm of emotions. Some merchants, ever practical, welcomed the change. Venice meant stability and a direct line to the lucrative markets of the Mediterranean. For shipbuilders, sailors, and traders, the prospect of Venetian contracts glistened like a promise of wealth. But for many others, farmers from the hinterland, craftsmen loyal to the Hungarian crown, priests bound to the memory of Croatian autonomy. The sight of foreign flags felt like a wound to the soul. In taverns and marketplaces, whispers of betrayal echoed against the ancient walls. "Sold for a chest of gold," one fisherman muttered, his face twisted with contempt. "Our king has bartered us like cattle." Others cursed the name of Ladislaus, calling him not a monarch but a merchant of thrones. Stories spread of the midnight negotiations, each retelling more bitter than the last. Some claimed the Venetian envoys had bewitched the king. Others swore the gold was cursed, destined to bring ruin to all who touched it. Outside Zadar, the news traveled quickly along the rocky Dalmatian coast. In Split, Sebenik, and Trogar, towns long wary of both Venetian ambition and Hungarian neglect, reactions varied. Some councils sent envoys to Venice to negotiate favorable terms of surrender, hoping to avoid bloodshed. Others dug in, refusing to acknowledge the treaty. Split's leaders declared that no foreign republic could dictate their allegiance without a fight. In the mountains inland, the clans of Paljica and Ravni Kotari sharpened their blades and swore to defend their villages to the last man. Among these mountain warriors, the spark of rebellion found fertile ground. They were shepherds and farmers, hardened by centuries of fending off raiders and tax collectors alike. The Venetians, for all their wealth and cunning, underestimated their resolve. These Highlanders were bound not by written laws but by a code of honor and loyalty to the land. Their leaders, known as Vojvod, gathered in hidden valleys to plan resistance. Messages were carried by barefoot runners through forests and over crags, calling men to arms. "The king may sell our coast," one proclamation declared, "but the mountains are ours and no coin can buy them." Venice, aware of the growing unrest, responded with a mix of velvet diplomacy and iron discipline. The Senate dispatched seasoned governors or proveditore to oversee the newly acquired territories. These men were instructed to win hearts where possible and break resistance where necessary. They offered trade privileges to compliant towns, reduced taxes for those who swore loyalty, and promised protection from pirates and Ottoman raiders. At the same time, they quietly prepared for war, fortifying garrisons and stockpiling supplies. The Ottomans loomed large in Venetian calculations. To the southeast, the expanding empire of the sultans pressed relentlessly into the Balkans. Dalmatia was not merely a prize of commerce. It was a strategic shield against the Turkish advance. Venetian control of the coast allowed the Republic to maintain a chain of fortified ports that could resist Ottoman incursions and protect trade routes to the Levant. The Senate's message to Europe was clear. Venice had not stolen Dalmatia merely for profit. It had claimed it for Christendom. But for the Croats living under the new regime, this lofty justification was cold comfort. In Zadar itself, the occupation grew heavier by the day. Venetian governors imposed strict curfews, forbidding gatherings after sunset. Spies prowled the streets, listening for seditious talk. Those suspected of plotting rebellion were dragged before tribunals and sentenced to exile or the galleys. The once vibrant squares, where merchants from Ragusa and Dubrovnik once debated politics over wine, now echoed with the stern commands of foreign soldiers. The people endured, but resentment simmered like a hidden ember. Yet even as Venice tightened its grip, the spirit of defiance refused to die. Secret societies formed in the back rooms of monasteries and beneath the vaulted cellars of noble houses. Priests hid coded messages within holy texts, smuggling them to the mountain rebels. Women carried daggers beneath their shawls, ready to defend their families against marauding soldiers. Ballads of resistance spread through the countryside, sung in hushed tones by shepherds beneath the stars. Each verse carried the same refrain: "The lion may rule the city, but the heart of Dalmatia beats free." One of the most remarkable figures to emerge during this period was a young nobleman known to history as Marco of Nîmes. Born into a family of minor aristocrats, Marco witnessed the Venetian takeover with a fury that hardened into resolve. He rallied a band of guerrilla fighters who struck at Venetian patrols, ambushed supply caravans, and melted back into the mountains before the occupiers could retaliate. His exploits became legend. Venetian officials branded him a bandit. To the people, he was a hero, a living reminder that no treaty could erase the Croatian will to resist. The Venetians responded with brutal efficiency. Rewards were offered for Marco's capture. Entire villages suspected of aiding his fighters were fined. Their men pressed into labor on Venetian ships. But each act of repression only fueled the resistance. Marco's network expanded, drawing recruits from across Dalmatia. Fishermen offered their boats for nighttime raids along the coast. Farmers hid weapons beneath their haystacks. Even some priests quietly blessed the rebels before Sunday Mass, invoking God's favor on their struggle. Meanwhile, King Ladislaus, the man whose decision had set these events in motion, retreated into comfortable obscurity. The gold he had accepted from Venice allowed him to strengthen his position in Naples and finance his ongoing battles in Italy. To the Dalmatian people, his name became synonymous with treachery. Chroniclers of the time record bitter jokes about Ladislaus the merchant, who sold a kingdom as easily as a fisherman sells a net. His betrayal hardened Croatian identity, forging a sense of unity born not of shared rulers, but of shared suffering. As winter descended on the Adriatic, the struggle entered a new phase. Venetian convoys faced increasing attacks from rebel fighters. Galleys disappeared in sudden storms, their crews vanishing without a trace. Rumors swirled of secret alliances between the mountain clans and pirates from the southern seas. Some claimed Ottoman agents were supplying the rebels, eager to destabilize Venetian rule. Whether true or not, these whispers kept the Senate awake at night, aware that the gold they had spent had purchased not peace, but a restless frontier. In the candlelit chambers of the Doge's palace, debates raged. Should Venice unleash the full might of its fleet to crush the resistance, risking a costly war? Or should it continue the delicate dance of bribery and negotiation, hoping to wear down the rebels over time? The Senate ultimately chose a middle path, a combination of punitive expeditions and calculated concessions. It was a strategy that would define Venetian rule in Dalmatia for centuries, a constant balancing act between force and diplomacy, oppression and persuasion. For the Croats of Dalmatia, the Pact of Zadar became more than a political betrayal. It was a test of endurance. Under Venetian rule, they would suffer taxes, censorship, and the slow erosion of their autonomy. Yet they would also preserve their language, their customs, and their unbreakable connection to the land. Every act of rebellion, every whispered song of defiance, became a declaration of survival. As the year turned, the Adriatic winter winds carried both the scent of salt and the promise of continued struggle. Venice had gained a kingdom without a battle, but holding it would demand an endless campaign of vigilance. The Lion of St. Mark now prowled the Dalmatian coast, but in the mountains above, the heart of Croatia still beat to a rhythm that no coin could silence. The winter of 1409 settled heavily over the Adriatic, but the struggle for Dalmatia burned hotter than ever. Beneath the white frost that coated the olive trees and stone walls, the people of Zadar and the surrounding coast carried a tension that no season could chill. The Pact of Zadar had been signed months before, but its repercussions were only beginning to unfold. Venice held the keys to the ports, the fortresses, and the trade routes, yet the soul of Dalmatia remained defiantly untamed. By early spring, the first organized uprisings began to flicker across the rugged hinterlands. In the mountain stronghold of Poljica, village leaders convened under torchlight to draft a clandestine pact of their own. They pledged to resist Venetian taxes, shelter fugitives, and maintain supply routes for rebels operating in the coastal lowlands. Their oath was sealed not with signatures, but with shared wine and a ceremonial passing of blades, a tradition older than any treaty or king. It was a promise carved into their bloodlines. The mountains would not bow. In Split, the atmosphere was equally charged. Though the city's merchant elite hesitated to openly defy the Republic, the common people found subtle ways to undermine Venetian authority. Fishermen lost shipments meant for Venetian markets, diverting them to hidden coves where smugglers could retrieve the goods. Artisans crafted coded messages into church carvings, embedding warnings and rallying cries in the stonework itself. Children played games in the squares that secretly mapped out the positions of Venetian patrols. Resistance in Dalmatia was not only a battle of swords but of wits. Meanwhile, the Senate in Venice faced a growing dilemma. Reports from Dalmatia described not a peaceful transition of power, but a tinderbox ready to explode. Governors complained of ambushes along the mountain roads, of villages that vanished into silence when troops approached, and of merchants refusing to pay tariffs despite threats of imprisonment. The cost of maintaining order began to climb, straining the Republic's coffers at a time when Venetian fleets were already stretched thin by conflicts in the Aegean and rivalries with Genoa. To counter the unrest, the Senate dispatched one of its most cunning officials, Proveditore Andrea Contarini, a seasoned diplomat with a reputation for mixing charm with menace. Contarini arrived in Zadar with a fleet of sleek galleys and an entourage of advisors skilled in both politics and espionage. His mission was clear: break the will of the rebels without igniting a war that might invite Ottoman opportunism. He began with calculated generosity, offering amnesties to rebels who laid down arms and promising reduced taxes for towns that swore loyalty. But beneath the velvet words lurked an iron fist. Those who refused his terms soon found their villages burned, their leaders dragged in chains to Venetian galleys bound for distant prisons. Yet even Contarini's carefully balanced approach could not extinguish the spirit of defiance. In the highlands, Marco of Nîmes and his band of fighters intensified their attacks. They struck with surgical precision, targeting supply convoys and isolated garrisons. One moonless night, they raided a Venetian warehouse in Sebenik, torching valuable grain stores and vanishing into the mountains before dawn. The Venetians responded with brutal reprisals, but each act of punishment only deepened the locals' hatred and strengthened the rebels' resolve. Among the rebels, alliances began to take shape that startled both Venice and the Hungarian crown. Croatian Highlanders, traditionally wary of outside powers, opened secret channels to Ragusan merchants from Dubrovnik, who supplied weapons and information under the guise of neutral trade. Even more daring were the quiet overtures to Ottoman agents operating across the border in Bosnia. Though the Ottomans were viewed as a looming threat, some rebel leaders reasoned that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Venetian spies intercepted letters hinting at these dangerous flirtations, sending shockwaves through the Doge's council. Inside the grand halls of the Doge's palace, debates grew increasingly fierce. Some senators argued for an overwhelming military campaign to crush the resistance once and for all, even if it meant risking open war with Hungary or provoking Ottoman intervention. Others warned that heavy-handed tactics would only drive the Croats into Ottoman arms, creating a volatile frontier that could bleed Venice's resources for generations. The Senate's final decision was a compromise, a strategy of selective terror combined with subtle co-optation. Contarini was given authority to reward cooperative leaders with titles and trade privileges, while covert assassins were dispatched to quietly eliminate the most troublesome rebel chiefs. But Dalmatia was not so easily subdued. The land itself conspired against the occupiers. Its jagged mountains, labyrinthine caves, and treacherous coastal inlets offered endless hiding places. Venetian patrols frequently disappeared into the fog, their ships wrecked on unseen reefs or their troops lured into ambushes by false guides. The Adriatic winds carried more than salt. They carried the songs of freedom that echoed from village to village, reminding the people of their ancient right to self-rule. Zadar, the jewel of the coast and the centerpiece of the Pact, became a stage for this invisible war. By day, the markets bustled with merchants selling olive oil, salt, and silk under the watchful eyes of Venetian guards. By night, secret meetings unfolded behind shuttered windows. Monks smuggled coded messages inside prayer books. Fishermen ferried rebel couriers across moonlit waters, their boats slipping between Venetian patrols like shadows. The city lived a double life, outwardly obedient, inwardly defiant. In one of the most daring acts of resistance, a group of young Zadar nobles planned a coordinated uprising time to coincide with a major religious festival. Their goal was to seize the Venetian garrison while the soldiers were distracted by the celebrations, then signal the mountain clans to descend upon the city. The plot was nearly flawless, but a single careless whisper betrayed them. Venetian spies arrested the conspirators days before the festival, executing the ringleaders in the main square as a grim warning. Their bodies hung for weeks at the city gates, a silent message to anyone tempted to follow their example. Despite such setbacks, the resistance adapted. Leaders learned to move like water, never lingering long enough to be captured. They avoided grand gestures, favoring small, persistent acts of defiance. Sabotaged supply lines, sudden ambushes, and the slow erosion of Venetian authority through noncompliance. Their strategy was not to win a decisive battle, but to bleed Venice slowly, to make the cost of occupation greater than any treasure Dalmatia could provide. Meanwhile, King Ladislaus remained a ghostly figure in the background. Secure in Naples, he spent the Venetian gold to consolidate his Italian holdings, largely ignoring the chaos he had unleashed across the Adriatic. To the Croats, his absence was a fresh betrayal. Chroniclers recorded bitter jokes about how the king who sold Dalmatia now feasted in comfort while his former subjects spilled their blood in endless skirmishes. His silence only hardened the rebels' conviction that they could rely on no sovereign but themselves. As months stretched into years, the conflict settled into a tense stalemate. Venice controlled the major ports and trade routes, but the hinterlands remained defiantly outside its grasp. Every concession wrung from the Senate was earned with blood. Every new tax imposed by Venetian governors was met with sabotage or open rebellion. The Adriatic became a chessboard of shifting alliances, secret deals, and sudden betrayals. Ragusa played its careful game of neutrality, trading with both sides while quietly passing intelligence to the rebels. Ottoman envoys lingered on the borders, offering aid with one hand while sharpening their swords with the other. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this protracted struggle was the endurance of Dalmatian identity. Despite the chaos, or perhaps because of it, the people clung fiercely to their language, customs, and faith. They celebrated ancient festivals, sang ancestral songs, and preserved oral histories that mocked Venetian pretensions of civilization. Each story told around a village fire became an act of cultural resistance, a reminder that empires rise and fall, but a people's spirit endures. By the mid-1410s, Venice began to realize that total conquest was an illusion. The Pact of Zadar had given them legal claim to Dalmatia, but law could not command loyalty. The Senate shifted its strategy from domination to coexistence. Governors were instructed to negotiate more equitable trade agreements, reduce the harshest taxes, and allow local councils limited autonomy in exchange for nominal allegiance. It was not a victory for the rebels, nor a defeat for Venice, but a fragile equilibrium that allowed both sides to breathe. And yet, beneath this uneasy peace, the embers of defiance still glowed. Marco of Nine and his fighters remained at large, their exploits feeding the legend of an unconquered Croatia. Ballads of their raids spread across the Adriatic, carried by sailors and merchants to distant ports. To the Venetians, these songs were dangerous propaganda. To the Croats, they were lifelines, proof that even in the shadow of a mighty republic, freedom could survive in the cracks of empire. The Pact of Zadar had redrawn the map of Dalmatia, but it could not erase the lines etched into the hearts of its people. The Lion of St. Mark might command the harbors, but the mountains belonged to the Croats, and in those mountains the idea of liberty continued to sharpen its claws. The Uskics' daring raids on the Adriatic were more than acts of survival. They were a declaration of defiance against the empires that surrounded them. By the early 17th century, their reputation had reached every corner of the Mediterranean. Merchants whispered their name in dread, while oppressed Christian peasants across the Balkans hailed them as heroes who dared to strike back against Ottoman dominance. But fame brought danger. The Habsburgs, who had once tolerated and even quietly supported the Uskics, now faced immense pressure from Venice, whose lucrative trade routes were being crippled by constant piracy. As Venetian merchants lost fortunes to Uskic ambushes, the Serenissima grew desperate. Venetian captains described sudden attacks in the dead of night, swift wooden boats slicing through moonlit waters, crossbows and arquebus flashing, cargo seized before dawn. To Venice, the Uskics were not rebels, they were criminals and terrorists. The Senate demanded action, sending emissaries to the Habsburg court in Graz to insist that these wolves of Senge be leashed. The Habsburg response was ambivalent. Officially, they condemned piracy. Privately, many Austrian commanders admired the Uskics' ability to weaken Ottoman power and frustrate Venetian ambitions. Yet, the political balance was shifting. Peace treaties between Austria and the Ottoman Empire made Uskik raids inconvenient. Each attack threatened to reignite war. And so, the once useful pirates became pawns in a dangerous diplomatic game. Meanwhile, life inside the fortress town of Senge remained as harsh and defiant as ever. Perched on the rugged Velebit coast, Senge was a place where stone walls met crashing waves, and where every family carried weapons as naturally as they carried faith. The Uskiks trained their children in the art of ambush from an early age. Boys learned to handle sabers before they could read. Girls mastered the skills of camouflage and survival. Their songs, half prayer, half war cry, echoed across the cliffs, celebrating victories and mourning martyrs. Stories spread of incredible feats. A handful of Uskik fighters boarding a Venetian galley and overpowering a crew 10 times their size. Women of Senge hurling rocks and boiling water from the battlements to repel invaders. Priests blessing raiding parties as they slipped into the night. To outsiders, these tales were shocking. To the Uskiks, they were simply life. But the storm was building. By 1615, Venetian patience had run out. A series of escalating raids, including the capture of valuable spice ships, led Venice to declare open war. The conflict became known as the Uskik War, a brutal, 3-year struggle that drew in not only Venice and the Habsburgs, but also Spain, the Papal States, and even distant allies seeking to protect their trade interests. The opening battles were swift and savage. Venetian galleys attempted to blockade Senge, but the Uskiks knew every hidden cove and treacherous current of the Adriatic. They struck with lightning speed, vanishing into sea caves and mountain passes before the enemy could react. Venetian captains complained bitterly that they were fighting ghosts, fighters who seemed to emerge from the very rocks and waves themselves. Yet for all their courage, the Uskiks faced overwhelming odds. Venice possessed one of the most powerful navies in the world, and the Habsburgs, under pressure from European allies, were no longer willing to provide covert support. Supplies in Senge grew scarce. Hunger gnawed at the population, and whispers of betrayal filled the narrow stone streets. Some elders argued for negotiation. Others swore to fight to the death, declaring that surrender would mean dishonor worse than starvation. One chilling winter night, Venetian cannon fire shattered part of Senge's outer wall. Uskik fighters rushed to plug the breach with their own bodies, firing muskets and hurling flaming pitch. A mother was said to have carried her newborn child in one arm while reloading her husband's gun with the other. The defenders held, but at a terrible cost. The dead were buried in mass graves beneath the frozen earth, and the living prepared for the next assault. Far from the Adriatic, European diplomats debated the fate of the Uskiks in candlelit halls. Letters flew between Vienna, Madrid, and Rome, each side blaming the other for the escalation. The Papal States worried that continued violence would weaken Christian unity against the Ottomans. Spain, though officially neutral, secretly admired the Uskiks' defiance of Venetian trade power. But politics, as always, demanded compromise. The eventual treaty favored Venice, granting them control over key sea lanes and demanding the disbandment of the Uskik bands. When the treaty was finally signed in 1617, it felt less like peace and more like betrayal. The Habsburgs, eager to avoid further conflict, agreed to remove the Uskiks from Senge and resettle them inland. Imperial troops arrived with orders to disarm the very men they had once celebrated as defenders of Christendom. The Uskiks, proud and unyielding, resisted at first. Some fought bloody skirmishes in the mountains, refusing to abandon their coastal stronghold. Others, weary of endless war, reluctantly laid down their weapons. The forced resettlement was a tragedy cloaked in bureaucracy. Families were split, traditions uprooted. Some Uskiks were relocated to the interior of Croatia, far from the sea that had defined their identity. Others disappeared into the rugged landscapes of Dalmatia, becoming bandits or mercenaries. A few continued their raids in secret, now branded outlaws by all sides. Their songs turned mournful, filled with longing for the crashing waves and salt-scented winds of Senge. Yet even in defeat, the Uskik legend refused to die. Venetian sailors still feared the shadow of sudden attack long after the last official Uskik raid. Ballads carried across the Balkans, praising the courage of men and women who had dared to challenge empires. Parents told their children of heroes who lived by the code of freedom, answering to no king or sultan. Centuries later, Senge remains a town of stone and memory. Visitors can walk the same narrow alleys where Uskic fighters once sharpened their blades, and climb the Niage fortress, whose massive walls still bear the scars of Venetian cannon fire. The sea, ever restless, whispers of the daring raids that once made the Adriatic tremble. The story of the Uskics is not merely a tale of pirates and battles. It is a chronicle of a people who refused to surrender their autonomy, even when crushed between the ambitions of mighty empires. Their struggle raises timeless questions. What is the price of freedom? How far will ordinary men and women go to defend their way of life? And when history remembers them as both heroes and criminals, which truth truly matters? As the sun sets over the Velebit Mountains, the fortress of Senge casts long shadows across the sea, a reminder that even in defeat, the spirit of resistance endures. The Uskics may have been scattered, but their story continues to haunt the Adriatic, a legend of freedom carved into stone and salt. The fall of the Uskics was not a single dramatic moment but a slow unraveling, a story of betrayal, exile, and the stubborn survival of a spirit that refused to die. After the Treaty of 1617, Senge became a town under watchful occupation. Imperial troops patrolled the stone streets where Uskic children had once played war games, their presence a daily reminder that the old ways were forbidden. Yet, beneath the surface, the heartbeat of resistance continued to echo. Families torn from the coast struggled to adapt to life inland. Many were relocated to scattered villages across the Croatian interior, far from the salt spray and crashing waves that had defined their existence. These settlements, cold, isolated, and often hostile, felt like prisons to a people who had been born to the sea. Men who once navigated treacherous currents with instinctive precision now plowed rocky soil, their calloused hands itching for the weight of a sword or oar. Women who had once sung ballads of victory now whispered laments of loss. Children, too young to remember the thunder of cannons, grew up on stories of a homeland they might never see again. Despite the forced dispersal, the Uskics did not disappear. Some bands simply refused relocation, vanishing into the rugged Velebit Mountains where Habsburg soldiers dared not follow. There, hidden among pine forests and limestone cliffs, they became outlaws in the purest sense, raiding caravans, harassing tax collectors, and keeping alive the traditions of ambush and escape. For the authorities, these remnants were a nightmare. Too small to crush in open battle, too fierce to ignore. The mountains became a labyrinth of defiance, where every cave might conceal a hidden arsenal and every shepherd could be a scout. Others drifted south, finding refuge among kindred spirits along the Dalmatian coast. Some became privateers in the service of foreign powers, Spain, Naples, even Venice itself. Ironically, Venetian captains occasionally hired former Uskics to guard their own ships, trusting their unrivaled knowledge of the Adriatic to protect against lesser pirates. The very men once branded as enemies of civilization now sailed under the banners of the same empires that had sought their destruction. It was a cruel twist of fate, but the Uskics adapted. Survival, after all, had always been their greatest weapon. Senge itself, though stripped of its fiercest defenders, remained haunted by their memory. Imperial governors attempted to turn the fortress into a quiet administrative outpost, but the stones of the Niage Tower carried a different energy. Travelers reported strange sensations while walking its battlements. A sense of being watched, of echoes just beyond hearing. Old women in the marketplace swore they could still hear phantom oars striking the waves on moonless nights. Fishermen claimed that the sea around Senge sometimes churned without wind, as if remembering the furious chases of centuries past. The Uskic legend spread far beyond Croatia. Across Europe, pamphlets and travelogues recounted their exploits, often exaggerating their cruelty or romanticizing their heroism. In Venice, playwrights depicted them as cunning villains who threatened the very lifeblood of trade. In Spain and France, poets celebrated them as noble rebels who stood against oppressive empires. Even in Ottoman lands, where they were hated as relentless raiders, the Uskics inspired a grudging respect. Their name became a symbol of both terror and freedom, a paradox that ensured their immortality in the imagination of the age. Generations later, their story would be woven into the larger narrative of Croatian identity. In the 19th century, as nationalist movements swept across Europe, writers rediscovered the Uskiks as symbols of a people's determination to resist foreign domination. Historians reframed their piracy as patriotism, emphasizing their role in defending Christian Europe from Ottoman expansion. Songs once sung in secret were revived in public festivals. Statues were erected in Senj, not of Venetian doges or Habsburg governors, but of Uskik captains with swords raised defiantly toward the sea. Yet the truth of the Uskiks is far more complex than the legends that followed. They were not simply heroes or villains, but a community shaped by desperation. Born in the shadow of collapsing empires, they lived in a world where survival demanded cunning, violence, and unwavering loyalty to their own. They were freedom fighters when fighting the Ottomans, pirates when plundering Venetian merchants, refugees when fleeing imperial crackdowns. Their morality was fluid because their reality was harsh. To understand them fully is to confront the uncomfortable fact that the line between outlaw and patriot is often drawn by whoever writes the treaties. Today, visitors to Senj can walk the same narrow alleys where Uskik warriors once plotted their raids. The Niaj fortress stands as a silent witness to centuries of conflict, its massive walls weathered by salt and wind, but still unbroken. From its ramparts, the view stretches across the Adriatic to the islands of Krk and Rab, the same waters where Uskik boats once lurked, waiting for the signal to strike. Guides tell stories of daring escapes, secret tunnels, and coded songs that warned of approaching enemies. The air smells of sea and history, a blend of salt and legend that lingers long after the tour is over. In the nearby museum, artifacts bring the Uskik world to life. Rusted swords and battered muskets, fragments of Venetian coins, faded maps of trade routes, all testify to a life of constant movement between survival and defiance. There are letters written by Venetian governors pleading for their destruction, alongside church records blessing their missions as holy crusades. Each object speaks to the contradictions of a people who were both blessed and cursed by geography, caught between sea and empire, freedom and extinction. The cultural memory of the Uskiks also survives in local festivals. Every summer, Senj hosts reenactments where men don leather armor and women wear traditional garments, recreating the songs and dances of their ancestors. Children chase each other through the fortress courtyards, wooden swords clashing in playful mimicry of long-ago battles. Fireworks explode over the harbor as boats decorated with torches glide across the darkened sea, their reflections shimmering like ghosts of the legendary Uskik raiders. These celebrations are not merely entertainment. They are acts of remembrance, affirming a connection to a past that refused to be erased. The Uskik story also carries lessons for the present. In an age of shifting alliances and contested borders, their experience reminds us how ordinary people can become pawns in the games of empires. The Uskiks were alternately supported, condemned, and betrayed by the very powers that claimed to protect them. Their rise and fall reveal how quickly a group can move from ally to enemy when political winds change. Yet their resilience also shows how identity can survive displacement. Even after losing their homeland, the Uskiks maintain their traditions, passing down stories that outlived the treaties meant to silence them. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the Uskiks lies in their refusal to accept the roles assigned by others. They were labeled pirates, rebels, heroes, and criminals, but they defined themselves simply as free men and women defending their way of life. Their motto, never formally written but lived in every action, could be summarized in a single defiant declaration: "We answer to no one but God and our own." As dusk settles over the Adriatic and the wind howls through the Niaj fortress, it is easy to imagine the Uskiks still watching from the shadows. The sea below, restless and eternal, carries their memory like a tide that cannot be tamed. They may have been driven from Senj, scattered across mountains and foreign ports, but their spirit remains carved into the very stones of Croatia's coast. The Uskiks of Senj were more than a footnote in maritime history. They were a people who embodied the eternal tension between order and freedom, empire and independence. Their story is not merely about the past. It is a warning and an inspiration for every age. For as long as waves crash against the fortress walls, the legend of the Uskics will endure, fierce, unyielding, and forever free.